because this parent was, a big stakeholder in the school, the administration was sort of kind of like basically telling me to let her do the paper again or change the grade. So we were in this big conference and with the parent and the administrators, and they were kind of hinting like, well, and so I just called them on it. I said, so let me just clarify. As my supervisor, are you telling me to raise the grade? And if so, what grade do you want me to raise it to? And so we can all make it clear that that's what you're asking me, because I said, I feel like that's what you're saying, but not saying it. So I would like you to specifically say, are you asking me to raise her grade from an F to a C? Or would you like a C plus or B based on this parent's request? What is it that you want me to do? I was like naming it, like, listen, let's not play. And then like, oh, well, and everyone's all uncomfortable and everything.
Amidst all of the conversation about recruiting Black educators, where are the discussions about retention? The Exit Interview podcast was created to elevate the stories of Black teachers, professors, counselors, social workers, and administrators who have been pushed out of the traditional education space. My co-host, Kevin Adams, and me, Dr. Asia Lyons, are on a mission with our guests to inform school districts, teachers unions, families, students, educators, and others interested in understanding the challenges of retaining Black people in education. Welcome to The Exit Interview, a podcast for Black educators. All right, welcome back, everyone, to another episode of The Exit Interview, a podcast for Black educators. My name is Dr. Asia Lyons. My co-host, Kevin, is probably playing with his band somewhere, and we're going to support him. But we have a special guest on today, and I'm going to read her bio before we get started. Michelle Emmanuelle. So meet Michelle Emmanuelle, a wellness consultant, change maker, and professional speaker who supports individuals to live a life beyond burnout, which we love on this podcast. Her unique insight and practices empower resilience and serve as an agent for sustainable change. Sought after globally by diverse sectors of business such as Cisco and the NAACP, Michelle has over 15 years of experience in education, coaching, and consulting. Her clients consistently applaud her creativity, authenticity, and ability to create safe spaces. When she's not helping others to live a life more balanced, Michelle can be found indulging in French conversation, dreaming of her next travel adventure, hiking, dancing, and enjoying good food with good people. Michelle's philosophy is that change only happens when it is sustainable, embodied, and accompanied with ongoing support and accountability. Some of her training certifications are somatic coaching, healing race-based trauma, somatic stress and anxiety release, over 500 hours of yoga and neuroscience of healing. Wow. Welcome to the show, Michelle.
Thank you so much, Asia. Nice to be here. Appreciate the invitation.
Yeah, of course. Michelle and I met because we're both Schmillies. So out there, for folks who don't know, and I've always talked about this, I read this book a while back, We Should All Be Millionaires by Rachel Rogers, and joined a Facebook group where Rachel and her coaching folks go on and support women, specifically everyone who's invited, but mostly women on their business journey. So I believe we had a conversation in the DMs, and so we connected several times, and we finally decided it was time for her to come on the podcast. So I'm so excited to chat with you and to have you share your story.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Yeah.
Happy Sunday.
Thank you. Happy Sunday. Beautiful here in Denver. Tell us where you are.
I am in San Francisco, and it's actually raining. I almost said snowing, which nope, not snow. It's actually raining, but still pretty nice temperature-wise, like in the 60s. So, but it's kind of one of those rainy Sundays, which is fine.
Yeah. Yeah, we don't get too much rain here. Fortunately and unfortunately, because it gets super dry. But yeah, we're not here for me. So let's get into it. So in your bio, you talk about involving or indulging in French conversation. You were a French educator. Tell us all about that. What made you decide to become a French teacher? What's your journey?
Well, French is my first/second language. And so it felt like a natural transition to get my degree in French. And education was something that I thought of like, hey, maybe I'll be a translator at the UN and all these different things. Like, wow. In the end, I just thought, I'll be a teacher. So I decided to get my credential in French to be a French teacher. At the time, I was also teaching French and English because they needed a dual language teacher at the time. That's the short version. There's so much more of it.
Yeah. We love the long version here on our podcast. So please don't think we are talking too much. But what grades did you teach, or did you teach in higher education? Where? For how long? We love the details.
So I started out in middle school, and then so the English classes were in middle school and my French classes were high school level. I was a yoga and wellness fitness teacher at a high school in Oakland for a little over a year. Well, just before the pandemic. So most of my classroom teaching experience would probably be mostly high school age, but I started out with the middle school age with the English classes.
I'm going to take a guess that it was French, but between the English and the French classes and between the two different grade levels, which did you like the most?
I like them both for different reasons. When I first started teaching, people were like, oh, middle school. Oh, I thought they were fun. I like them.
Yeah.
I feel like they're like that sweet spot, where they're like still little kids and they'll listen to you, but they're also old enough to like more complicated concepts and conversations. I enjoyed high school because they're just getting into that age where they're starting to figure things out. And also they're still goofballs. Sometimes high school has, too cool for school attitude, which, that's not fun to teach. But, I just found that each grade had something that I really appreciated. I think I was more pleasantly surprised by middle school because I was warned against it by so many people like, oh my gosh, good luck. And I thought, what? This is fun. What are you talking about? So I think it really depends on the person.
Yeah. I taught middle school for 6 years, and we have folks on the podcast all the time who taught middle school, 7th, 8th, or 6th grade. And we did the same thing. Folks who are meant for middle school, we loved it, right?
Yeah.
Or love it. I always say I have a K-6 license that I think is expiring probably this year. But I taught 6th grade and really enjoyed it, especially because it felt like, especially in the beginning of middle school, it felt like my 6th graders were a big 5th grader, right? And they still really wanted to work really hard to please their teachers, to show up, to do the thing. They weren't too cool yet. It wasn't to the end of 6th grade. Yeah, it wasn't to the end of 6th grade, beginning of 7th, when we started to see that, like, teachers aren't cool anymore. It's just about my friends or my whatever, which is like, developmentally appropriate, I guess. But yeah, I never had any complaints about teaching middle school.
Yeah, I hear you. Yeah. I think it's case by case.
Exactly. How long did you teach?
Let's see. Off and on, I probably taught a total of, I say off and on because when I was teaching that time period with English and French, I stopped teaching, and then, sounds odd, but I stopped teaching so I could become a professional dancer. And then I went back to teaching. So I would say the total amount of time that I was in the classroom teaching was about 3.5 years. The half year was during the pandemic, and I was released from my position.
So that gets into that conversation of what made you decide to leave education. And so you said you were released from your position. Is it because of the pandemic?
A couple things. First, I realized that when I was a classroom teacher full-time at a school, I realized that, while I loved teaching, I wasn't necessarily crazy about the system, the educational system. I found it really problematic, especially as an English teacher. I just felt like a lot of people were falling through the cracks, and the load and the requests and the obligations on teachers, I just felt was unreasonable in proportion to the pay. So I just found like I actually was working at a private school at the time too. And so I realized that I still incorporate teaching in what I'm doing now, but I left teaching at that particular time because of what I call the 3 Ps, the parents, the politics, and the paperwork. As an English teacher, I just felt like I was inundated with this grading constantly. And it wasn't even my forte because I wanted to be the French teacher. Because I was at a private school, I ran into some very challenging situations with parents, feeling very entitled and being told that they are paying my paycheck and I need to listen to what they have to say. And I ran into quite a lot of racism. I mean, pretty bad. So, I just felt like, no. That's one of the things, but I actually really do love teaching. I think it's actually one of my natural gifts. And so I'm happy that I did go back into education. That's why I went into as the yoga and wellness teacher, because I wanted to do something more sustainable and that was actually going to support people. So I was still within the educational system without necessarily having to be so restricted in terms of how I was doing the work that I was doing.
Yeah, that makes sense. When we talk on the show, on this podcast about labor of being an educator, that's like one piece of it. But mostly what we talk about here is that second layer of showing up in like a Black body and having to navigate the racialized pieces of the world, right? And saying like, it's not just being a teacher that's hard, it's being a Black teacher, specifically for many of our guests, Black women who have to navigate this space. Some of them have been in private school, some in public, some in whatever different spaces. And it was really challenging. And it taught them that wasn't the place they wanted to be, is in this type of traditional classroom space.
Absolutely. That was definitely my experience as well.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, it's super unfortunate. When you were experiencing, share as little as you like, as much as you like, no pressure. But when you were talking about your racialized experience, we find that people talk about, they share with their family members or they kind of process it through with someone. When you were having these experiences, was there people that you talked to about the situation or did you kind of internalize it? How did that work?
Well, thankfully, I was able to have a conversation with my mom. And there is a specific situation that happened. I was teaching in my English class, I was teaching a particular book, and there is a reference to the Deep South and the racism and, some references to the enslavement of Black people. And they had a paper that they needed to do. My mom, she's passed now, but she originally from the South. And I thought, this is great. I'm going to have her be interviewed. So, I set up this thing where the class can ask her questions about her time growing up in South Carolina. And I got so much flack from the administration. And one woman actually insisted that her daughter write the paper that she turned in on slavery was about white people, white slavery. Super off topic of the book. And it was ridiculous. Thankfully, I had a rubric and she just basically didn't follow anything. So I failed her. And so, of course, the mom's like, oh, this is racist. I'm like, okay, whatever. But the administration got in and because this parent was, a big stakeholder in the school, the administration was sort of kind of like basically telling me to let her do the paper again or change the grade. So we were in this big conference and with the parent and the administrators, and they were kind of hinting like, well, and so I just called them on it. I said, so let me just clarify. As my supervisor, are you telling me to raise the grade? And if so, what grade do you want me to raise it to? And so we can all make it clear that that's what you're asking me, because I said, I feel like that's what you're saying, but not saying it. So I would like you to specifically say, are you asking me to raise her grade from an F to a C? Or would you like a C plus or B based on this parent's request? What is it that you want me to do? That was like naming it, like, listen, let's not play. And then like, oh, well, and everyone's else uncomfortable and everything. And they're like, well, how about allowing her to do the paper over? And again, because I had a rubric that outlined how the paper was being graded, I showed that she covered none of it. And I said, well, let me understand why she gets the justification of having another chance at this. When I explained it to the entire class, she was present. She was never absent. And assignment was clear. Why should she get to rewrite her paper as opposed to no one else and this paper that's off topic? Yeah. And so again, and they couldn't really justify it. But they're wanting me to do it. I said, so again, as my supervisor, are you actually telling me to do that because you have the authority to tell me to do so? Or are you telling me what's the outcome that you want from this meeting? So I was just nailing them, I'm like, don't play. Finally, they're like, well, and they hem and hawed and everything. But I basically held my ground and I allowed everybody who didn't get a passing grade to redo it. I wasn't going to give her preferential treatment. I'm like, either everyone does or no one does. And I said, and I get an assistant to grade because I'm not going to regrade all this. I don't have time. You know what I mean? But anyway, it was ridiculous.
It sounds like you said that was one of many situations. This is such an interesting story because there's so many folks who have similar experiences, right? And this idea of like, I'm going to assume that your heart was pounding. I would have been saying the things, but in my mind, like everything's happening in slow motion and still saying like, this has to be said. And it's very interesting that principal administrators are asking you to do these things and not wanting to say it out loud. And we were talking about, me and a good friend, Dr. Daisa Daniel, have been talking a lot about default characteristic of America is niceness, right? And you weren't being nice by making them say that they wanted grade to be changed. You weren't being nice by saying they had to rewrite the paper over again. You're supposed to figure that out so that they're not uncomfortable in their whiteness.
Exactly.
And you're supposed to read between the lines, and you're forcing them to say things out loud. And that's not nice. And in America, we are nice or you are punished, right? Mm-hmm. It is so true, right? So that's been something we've been talking a lot about. And now that we're having this conversation, Daisa and I, it just pops up so much about this expectation of dice. And the fact that even going a step further and saying this parent obviously thought you weren't being nice by hurting her child's feelings by talking about enslavement of Africans, right? That's not nice. So as a retaliation of this, I'm going to show white violence by submitting a paper on white slaves or whatever that was, right?
Right.
So it's just like all the pieces. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that story.
You're welcome. Like I said, one of many. I mean, and as an administrator working at this school, which I forgot to include in my educational background for a time, also a private school with no scholarship. So the demographic was primarily white with a sprinkling of Asian. And I was the only Black person on staff. That was hugely problematic. And because it was a private school, they happened to be open Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday. You know, I worked there for a year and a half. And I was like, I'm calling in sick. I was like, I'm not going to be here. And then we had a moment when this is an interesting situation because this private school is owned by a corporation. And it's a national school. So there are many different schools across the nation. And the CEO was making rounds to the different schools. And it came up there in our meeting, you know, about why this holiday isn't being acknowledged. And the director of the school literally told me, don't rock the boat. I wasn't quite in compliance. I was quiet, just like, whatever, girlfriend, I'm going to do what I want, you know?
Yeah.
And in the meeting, it turned out that somebody else, one of the other teachers actually asked, you know, well, why are we open on this holiday? And his response was, oh, when we were putting the school calendar together, we were just finding the days to align with the public schools. And we just didn't realize, you know, and she said, well, it's a national holiday. He's like, yeah, well, we just didn't realize it. And then I
wasn't being nice by asking that.
Yeah. And so she really didn't like it. And she was getting all kinds of snake eyes from the director and she dropped it. I didn't though. I go, but, and then as soon as I said, but, I tell you, literally the director like palmed her hand on her forehead. She was just like, oh, she just like looked down and shaking her head. And I was like, no, I'm not letting this go. If I don't speak into that, nobody will. So I just said, how is it that we have all these tenets of the school that actually represent Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s accomplishments, and yet we're open on his birthday? I mean, I was just calling them out left, right, and center. And I have to say, I'm happy to say that they did change the policy. But the thing is, I was reprimanded after that meeting, quote unquote, causing problems, you know, and I was just like, you know what? Same thing. There was this meme that was another employee sent out an email for happy hour. And at the time there was an altercation in a Black neighborhood and a woman is interviewed. And in the interview, she said, ain't nobody got time for that. And it became a meme. So this invitation for happy hour was couched in this, let's go to happy hour because ain't nobody got time to not go or something like that. And I was like, what? And so I called that out. I said, I walked into the director's office that morning after I saw the email and I said, I would like to call an all staff meeting. And I wasn't asking. I was like, I'd like to call an all staff meeting and I'll lead it. And here's what I'm going to say. I was a thorn in her side. She was so excited when I quit. Like literally, she was like skipping. But, you know, I just called the staff out and I said, you know, this kind of thing is inappropriate and unacceptable. How are we as educators modeling this? And people are like, yeah, you know, I saw the email and all uncomfortable and everything. And I said, here's my issue is that I am the only one speaking into it and all you all are silent and complicit. And then you're going back into your classrooms and teaching next generation. I said, what are you teaching them? You know,
I love that.
So I was all about, and then another thing, the last one, but I was walking by the history teacher's classroom one day and his door was open just in time for hearing him say, every single person in the United States immigrated here. We are all immigrants. I just stood there and looked at him and I said, Mr. So-and-so, I said, everybody? And he goes, everybody. And I said, really? And I was just waiting for him to recognize me as a Black woman standing there talking to him.
Yeah.
And then one of the students was clearly like picking up where I was coming from. And he goes, well, Mr. So-and-so, do you mean Black people too? And he goes, oh, and his eyes got saucer big. He goes, oh, yeah, okay, well, not everybody immigrated here. And I'm like, dude, listen, here's this grown man standing in front of the classroom, apparently teaching, educating, quote unquote. Yeah, there were quite a lot of heavy lifts being the only at that particular school. I was the thorn. Administrative meetings, there's always this like, and let's see if we can comply what we're trying to do, and looking over at me. And I was like, well, whatever. I was just like, listen, I'm not going to work here and be quiet. That's harder. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
If they want me to treat me like a troublemaker, then at least I am speaking the truth and not letting things slide. But it just got to be, I left there for other reasons. My dad was, and I needed to make sure I was available at that time, but it was also clearly not a fit.
Yeah.
Oh gosh.
It's interesting because I know that people on listening, the people who are long-time listeners are going to say like, they hear the story and they hear the themes, and there's going to be folks who listen to this for the first time and say, well, if she was in a public school or something about inner city youth, or that's why such and such, and white people. And I just want to say that we've had private school folks on here. We've had public school folks on here. We've had all types of like 3 years of experience, 30 years of experience. And the story is the same. Inner city, working with non-Black leaders who are also non-white. The story is the same. And that's super unfortunate because always the kids miss out. And it's interesting that you're saying that, you left because your dad was ill and you wanted to make sure that you were by his side if he needed you. And then my question is, like, how long do you think you would have been able to go for doing that, constantly showing up and advocating that way? How long? And I know this may not be easy to answer necessarily, but do you feel like you could have kept going for another 5, 15, 10 years, 12 years? Or did you just know, like, if my dad was in good shape and he was well, maybe I would have finished the year and then went on to something else?
Yeah, I would have definitely finished the year and then moved on. I mean, the school itself was excessively toxic anyway. My experience was toxic, and the extra of being a Black woman and the only, in this particular environment. But my preference would have been to finish out the year. But at the same time, the stress and the anxiety that I was feeling, which is honestly why, like, I talk about burnout. It's like, I remember all these different things and recognizing like, oh my gosh, I was basically feeding into it. I understood how burnout worked. I was like, oh my gosh, no wonder I was so exhausted and fried all the time, But it was taking its toll on me health-wise. And I don't know that. I think there was definitely a grace in leaving sooner for my own mental health.
Yeah, I want to mention one more thing before I move on to the next question. You've talked about being the only one in the school and like that isolation. And I was the only one in the school for a while. And then I became one of 2, then one of 3, then back to 1. And folks would come and go. And it was super hard and very lonely. And I think that people don't understand. For some of us, when I was working, I love my students and I stayed for my students. But I did spend a lot of time in my classroom by myself just because of the endless white chatter. That's the only way I can describe it. It's just like the endless white, like anxious chatter.
I get that.
Yes, I know you do. I know you, I know you do get that, right? And it's like no space for anything but what they're talking about and their lived experience, and it's just like no room for anything else but. They just take up all the air in the room and not consider any other perspective but their own. And think that and assume, at least in my experience, that we're all in solidarity because like we're all teachers. So we all must have fill in the blank, especially in Denver, Colorado area. I didn't teach in Denver necessarily. So thank you for sharing that. And so that kind of goes on. Yeah. It goes on to my next question, which is, you were not an educator for a very long time, which is totally fine. But in your observation of your experiences on the back end and just kind of why you were experiencing it, what do you believe that school districts, unions, higher education can do to retain the Black teachers that they have? And I'm very specific when I'm saying retain versus recruit, because we're really good about recruitment and going to HBCUs and paying people to moving bonuses and all the other things to bring new Black folks into a space. But what do you think that folks should be doing out here, even families, even of students, what they could be doing to keep Black educators healthy and well, I mean, they can't determine that, but you understand what I'm trying to say, in their school spaces.
I'm not one of the 20-year veterans in education. However, the time that I was in education, I had the opportunity of being both a classroom teacher and in administration for a time. So I got a chance to see both sides of things. But one of the things I think is really, really important is representation in high leadership positions. I think that makes a huge difference if there is somebody, a Black person who is a principal, who is in a powerful decision-making position, because then there is a chance to actually feel more seen and heard. And also just recognize like, okay, you're not the only, but also that shows that there's a value. That school values the diversity aspect. They value the Black people in powerful positions. And it's not just you're only a teacher, get into those higher administrative positions, you have to work 3 times as hard or whatever. But I think, there has to be a value system in place, and that value system has to go beyond, as you said, just the recruitment. Well, a friend of mine, and I also read this somewhere, she says, the diversity part's easy. It's the equity part. That's the challenge. You can get diversity, as you said, HB, go into the places where the Black folks are. You can recruit all day long, but, so boom, we're diverse. But what happens after that? So I think that there really needs to be a foundational value that's recognized and implemented and has some kind of accountability, mentor programs, because just recognizing, like, I had people who were helping me and supporting me as a new educator. However, they were white. And so she was helping me in my subject matter, but things I was running into as a white woman, she couldn't speak to, So I think there needs to be also some kind of availability to have mentorship for us, by us kind of thing. You know what I mean? That who recognize the challenges and that we can go to these different, maybe even just like professional development specifically for Black educators. Maybe that exists. Again, I haven't been around in the educational system long enough to speak whether or not that's actually in place or not. I know that when I was working in Oakland, there was something like that, and it was very powerful. There were 2 opportunities to do that, and it was just for the Black teachers. And I remember people coming back feeling so much more empowered and seen and valued and heard and recognized. And it created a sense of solidarity too. And for those who are not in a space of having enough diversity for there to be solidarity, maybe they're the only one, at least they know that there's a connection someplace where they can go to get support. So something like that, I think that's vital.
Yeah, I love both of those. Representation in high leadership positions, mentorship programs for Black people, by Black people, with Black people. My first year teaching, I had a mentor who was assigned to me from the school district level. Her name was Sandy Mason. She is a Black woman. She's still alive today. And I didn't realize until I think just at this very moment how rare it is for a Black person in my school district to have a Black mentor, because at the time it was very hard to get into that program. Like, people didn't necessarily, they rotated out, but there weren't enough Black people in that mentorship program for us all to have Dr. Mason. And so I wonder who made that decision to put her with me. And whoever that person is, I'm super grateful, because she was amazing. And I also, I totally hear you about the representation in a high leadership position. What I'm finding on this podcast, and also, unfortunately, within the Black educator wellness cohort that I run with my co-facilitator, Dr. Ellie Cahill, is that our Black educators who are administrators now are getting burnt up. And it's even because they're now, a lot of them are out of the union. They're no longer able to be a part of the union as administrators. They're not protected by that. And when you're put into a space, some of them where the parents are white, the community gangs up, and I'm using that word intentionally, gangs up to mob that administrator and push them out. Yeah. And I've seen it so much where folks will say, I don't know why they put her in that school. They know the 2 principals ago, they had a Black woman there, and they know what the community did to that person. And so you see in folks who are excited to be administrators or were in a school for a long time doing really well, just all of a sudden get moved. and don't last in the district after that. And that's not just in the district that I was teaching in. It was lots of different districts. Even just recently, just kind of reviewing some of like educator wellness cohort applications for our next cohort. We read one of the applications and it was an administrator. And one of the questions in our application is, why this program? And she just said, because I really need it, like, period.
Hard stop.
Hard stop. Enough said. And so, yeah, and I'm totally in agreement with you. But back to what you said, the value part. Are they valued? Are they heard? Or are they just another token person that people of color, specifically Black women, can feel like, oh, look, we have such and such and such in that position.
Mm-hmm.
We all flock to that school. They move them. We're stuck over here in a system and a cycle starts all over again. So, yeah, I 100% agree with what you're saying. And I wish that more school districts took those suggestions seriously and then looked after these folks who are protecting Black teachers. You know what I mean?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. So you mentioned this just a moment ago, talking about like, now you understand burnout and how you're using it in your work. So now it's the question, my favorite question to ask, right? Is because, and we emphasize the question of like, what are you doing now? Because we want folks to know that there's lots of ways that we can still heal and support community, work with children, work with adults or whatever, and do the good work and not have to be in a traditional classroom space. So tell us, what are you doing now that you've left the classroom? We want to hear all the details.
Okay. Yay. Thank you for asking. So I call myself a wellness consultant. Basically, I focus on the holistic well-being of individuals. My emphasis is on stress, anxiety, and burnout prevention and support. When I first got into this, I was using my teaching skills to do one-on-one coaching. And because of the nightmarish administrator that I had, I wanted to focus on women executives because I thought, you know what? They're the last people who take care of themselves and the first people who need it. And I also saw that how this one woman, it was a top-down disaster, because she was so many things. Wow, if she's resourced, if she has the support she needs, she could be an amazing person and the retention level would go up and all the different things. I basically transitioned from that as I started learning more and more about burnout. What differentiates me, and like everybody, burnout now, not even such a buzzword because it's been around for a minute, but what differentiates me from what other people do is I focus on the causes of burnout, because burnout is like a giant bucket where everyone's just like, oh, I feel burnt out, I'm exhausted, I'm stressed, and it makes me blah. But through the different research that I've done and books read and all the different things, there were 7 different areas of burnout that were identified, like physical, mental, emotional, social, creative, all the different things. I actually added number 8. So that's my disclaimer is that it's not scientific, but it is straight up fact. The number 8 type of burnout is due to systemic oppression. And so if you talk about the average white man who is stressed and anxious and burnt out working 80 hours a week, and he literally is burnt out, you put him next to anyone who comes from a marginalized or historically excluded background, that person's going to be the same level burnt out in terms of all those same areas, emotionally, mentally, physically, etc. And then some. Let's add the extra, having to navigate daily the microaggression, suspicion, assumption, the lack of acknowledgement, representation, the equity, all of that extra that people, specifically Black folks, have to navigate on a daily basis goes into a person's nervous system, which means that the amount of burnout that happens is extra. And so statistically, Black women rank the highest when it comes to burnout because of that, as a woman and then being Black. And so just like all the extras. And so for me, the offerings that I have currently is I do workshops for organizations to help them to have cultures that are basically supporting their people to thrive. And so when I work with leaders and organizations, a lot of times I tell them, it's like, expectation for your employees is absolutely fine and normal. However, when there's an expectation, there needs to be a support system to go along with that expectation. They're expecting this person to perform at this particular level. How are they supporting them to actually do that? So it needs to have some kind of support system. That support system also looks like recognizing a person's well-being. And a lot of times when I talk to people in different organizations, I talk to them about recognizing that 8th type of burnout, which is due to systemic oppression. And I have a lot of friends who are DEI consultants who are out of a job now because it's not so popular, unfortunately. for me, it's so sort of like I can slide in to the wellness angle. It's just recognizing, listen, if you are actually wanting to support your diverse culture, you need to recognize that this is an element that impacts the culture. This type of burnout is actually impacting the culture, not just those of us who come from or African background, but all the different places of marginalized people, how that happens. So for me, the more I started learning, the more I started recognizing that I really wanted to have some area that I specifically do just for Black women. So I do group coaching specifically for Black women and also teens. So it looks like a couple of different ways. Periodically, I'll have on my website, okay, a new group coaching is starting November, whatever. If people want to join, that's great. But there's also an opportunity if, there are like some Black women or even a team of people who are like, you know what, it'd be great for our team to have group coaching. Then I also do it that way. So it's more like the curated, if a person's like, me and my 6 friends want to do this, or me and my 5 friends or whatever, then yes, that's an opportunity as well. So it's kind of more curated and already a sense of community and connection with the people that way. I also have a soft spot for educators, and there's a price on my website. If they're in education, I'm also recognizing like, you know what? I'm happy to work with them too. You know what I mean? Because I'm not trying to be accessible, but at the same time, where it feels fair to everybody. I don't typically announce that a lot, but because this is a specific for educator podcast, I wanted to say that definitely do try to work within what people can do so that they can get the help, because burnout's real. A lot of times what people don't realize regarding burnout is what happens many times is people quit because they just can't anymore. So what I try to do is support people and help them to recognize that some people don't have that luxury of just quitting. You know what I mean? It's like, hey, bills still need to get paid. They can't just like, I'm out, even though their body's saying to do that. So a lot of what I work from, like my foundation, my baseline, is the sustainability of things. And that's why I call my website Sustainable Change Maker, because change isn't change unless it's sustainable. And so what I try to show people, and this is probably part of the most challenging part about in terms of helping people to understand this framework, is when a person is ill with anxiety and stress and they're burnt out, the idea of adding anything else to their schedule, even something that's good for them, like this hour of coaching, is just like, oh, I can't, I have no time. There's just no way. So I start with the reframing of like, listen, creating, this hour is actually creating more space. And although, yes, it looks like there is something that they need to add this 1 hour, but in this hour, the value that they get in this hour is powerful, because in this hour, I start with mindset, because what happens a lot of times when people feel anxious and burnt out, the mindset is the first thing that starts telling them like, oh man, I can't do this anymore. And they don't have the opportunity to really do the things that they want to do, they feel like they can't anymore. And so I feel like the first thing I try to tell people is it starts with our mindset. And so what I tell them is that anxiety is often over-exaggeration of a threat and an underestimation of your ability to cope.
I love that.
So I'll say it again.
Please.
Yeah. Yes. Anxiety is often an over-exaggeration of a threat and an underestimation of your ability to cope. So the more we focus on being anxious and stressed and burnt out, that gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And then our sense of ability to actually deal with it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. It's almost like we become this tiny little person, and the anxiety is this big giant that's about to step on us. And so that's why I start with the mindset, just helping people to recognize, like, listen, first, let's just talk about what's real and that what's happening in the mind, because the mind is already kind of spinning up because it's out of balance. I mean, I can go on and on about basic. For me, I support helping people to reframe what's going on in their mind, helping them to find the physical practices that help them to actually find some sustainability in their health and their well-being. And a lot of times I tell people when they're talking about, I don't have time to do this and that, I have like the 30-second practices, the 1 minute, the 2 to 5 minutes, just to show them that a person can actually regulate and calm their nervous system, which basically means ease away some of the stress and anxiety in 30 seconds, in 60 seconds, in 2 to 5 minutes. That's part of the reframing that I work on in the group coaching, is just helping people to recognize, oh, there is time, there is an opportunity, it is accessible. Because a lot of times people feel like I don't have time, so it's not accessible, it's not attainable. Those are the two areas I start with. It is accessible. Look, you have 30 seconds. You can do a 30-second practice while you wait for the microwave. You know what I mean? Like, listen, I'm not even asking you to, add anything into your life. It's integrating these into the moments in your life. You know what I mean? We all have 30 seconds. We all have 60 seconds. I call them in between the Zoom calls, the 2 to 5 minute ones, for the person's working online. But, basically just helping people to see like the accessibility of things by like, look, you feel better in those 30 seconds. How do we start creating that into habit, the physical practices and then the sustainability? So it starts with the mind, then the body, and then how do we make it a habit? So it becomes their holistic well-being.
I love that. I did write that down because I know that there are folks, again, who are like, what do we need to do? And that mindset piece is huge, right? I know Kevin and I talk about this a lot, that, people can't leave. Kevin is an administrator. This year, he became an administrator in a public school near us. I left teaching in 2018, and I was one of those come hell or high water folks, but also living out a privilege of having a spouse that could take care of some of the bills. And also, my child was fairly young. We could figure some things out, but there are people who are taking care of themselves or of children. Or my favorite thing people say, I only have 5 more years and then I'm getting out of here, right? And so like, what does it mean to not just like barely make it, but really thrive in those 5 years so that they count for something? Because we assume that we're going to live that 5 years. We'll die at our desk, like literal. Can you walk us through a 30-second reframing? I'd love for the audience to have that tool in their tool belt.
Sure. I'll do a 30-second mental one. And this is basically having a moment of awareness. So at all times in our lives, whether we realize it or not, we are asking ourselves questions. How do I do this? How come this is happening? Why can't I do this? What's happening now? We're always asking ourselves questions. A lot of times when a person is feeling stressed and anxious, they're asking themselves, oh, what if this happens? Or what if it doesn't work out? What if I can't? So a 30-second reframing that I like to offer is simply like, what if everything you've been worried about works out great? So basically just reframing it to a place of positivity. And it's not like Susie Sunshine, like, okay, but there is scientific proof that what we think about, we manifest. If I say, okay, Dr. Aza, don't scratch your nose no matter what. All you're thinking about now is that I told you not to scratch your nose. And at some point you're going to, even slide. It's like, you know what I mean? Like just something super simple example. But at the same time is just recognizing that when a person is in that stressed and anxious place, what they're focusing on is what's causing them to be stressed and anxious, all the time. And like I said, lived it, been there daily. I still have my own practices. So the 30-second practice I like to encourage people is like 30 seconds, write down what if ... and then something positive. Whatever that stress is on the mind right now. Oh my gosh, it's the finances. What if I have all the money I need? What if, and you know what, just writing that down. And what I usually do is have people do a little check and like, how are you feeling before and how are you feeling afterwards? That just the practice of actually reframing like, oh, there's a possibility that things could actually be better. And that's the thing. When a person is feeling stressed and anxious, their narrative becomes like a single focus. And the idea that there can be any possibility and room for expansion and something new and better becomes so limited. And so this is a simple exercise of helping people reframe that. And it's like, oh, and so I was working with this organization and this woman, she forgot to mute herself. And I had a list of these things to help people kind of get started. And one of them was, that's like, what if everything that I'm so worried about works out? And she said, oh, she just like had this physical, like, oh God.
Yeah.
I mean, just the idea of me saying that, I could hear the sigh and this was on Zoom. So I saw her body relax. And because I said that, our mind, we can think ourselves into something in a heartbeat. If you start talking about someone who like really made you feel angry and you start talking about all of a sudden you're riled up again.
Right.
But then you talk about your best day ever. You're reliving that. It's like, oh yeah, that was awesome. It's what we focus on. So that reframing of just like, first of all, recognizing we are always asking ourselves questions. And so what if? This is just one of the questions. What if? And then put something positive, whatever the stress or the anxiety is, maybe it's just focusing on that one topic. Let's talk about money. Okay. And a person's just having some financial challenges. What if I have all the money I could ever possibly hope for? What if all my bills are paid early? What if I am debt free? What if I receive a raise? What if money comes to me unexpectedly? What if I can invest in my child, future? What if I can actually buy this, you know what I mean? So it's not just, unfortunately, money gets far more focused than it needs to be because it's our form of trade for whatever it is that we need. But the idea is just, this is another tangent, but I just need to say this, finish this thought, is that I'd like to encourage people too, in terms of reframing this mindset, is that money is a resource, not the source. And a lot of times when people are feeling stressed and anxious about money, it's because they're thinking that's the source. And if they're thinking, oh man, this position or this whatever, or this, you name it, they're thinking everything's banked on that. And it's not. It's a resource. Like air is a resource, water is a resource. We need that just as well. So again, there's power in the reframing. And that's why I start with that in the group coaching, because it's where change starts.
Oh man, I love that. Before we move on to our last question, tell us the website or how they can get in contact with you if folks are interested. Yeah.
Absolutely. So again, my website is called sustainablechangemaker.com. Yes. And that's the best way to get a hold of me because you can see what I do. There's like a section that talks about the workshops. There's a section that talks about the coaching, group coaching. And again, the group coaching can be, curated, you and your 5 girlfriends or whatever. I'm not sure if I'm going to be starting another group coaching on my own this year because the holidays are coming up. And because the holidays are coming up, I'm feeling like I should.
Yeah, that's real.
That's why I'm like, So I'm sitting with that and I'm very open to doing that. And you know what? If people have something to say about that, let me know because I'm literally sitting on the fence with that one. Like,
Yeah. But anyway, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just going to circle back and say that's how people can get a hold of me. The best way is through my website, sustainablechangemaker.com.
Thank you. And I want to say that maybe having a session over winter break for teachers or whatever might be something that makes sense because I know so many folks are like sprinting towards this time. Like, okay, I only have so many weekdays until Thanksgiving break. And then after that, 2 weeks, and then I'll be off for 2 weeks. And then we have MLK. This is literally how folks just kind of like,
it's true. I remember doing that.
Yeah. Oh yeah. We all did. Right. This is a half a day and then there's conferences. Right. And so maybe this is a time where people are feeling like this renewed sense of, I don't know. This is an interesting time, but I would say don't strike it out as a possibility because I know that folks are really contemplating a lot of things during winter break or this time like December, November about should they go back? Should they not? How they feeling, their mindset, and especially folks who know that after winter break is that long stretch. So just put that out there. So my last question, what's bringing you joy these days, Michelle?
It's interesting because I started my business during the pandemic and it started as a response to everything. George Floyd's murder and people being burnt out. And I was getting my my 500-hour certification in yoga. So what's bringing me joy right now is along with my business, I have some part-time in-person things that I'm doing that I'm really enjoying. I teach a corporate yoga class once a week and it's at this facility. Various organizations come to this one gym and I teach this class. I love being able to teach people in person. It's just like, yay. Also, I do some personal training in person. I think that's what's bringing me joy is reconnecting and serving people in person. I get a chance to connect and engage in a way that I don't get to when I do things online, and grateful for the opportunity to serve people online because it gives me so much more accessibility to people. But I also reminded, oh yeah, I really actually love being in person and that, and that's just fun for me. So that's definitely bringing me joy. And I'm super grateful and blessed for the opportunities to come up lately. That's literally just within the last couple of weeks.
Oh, I love that. I'm not the person to be in person like all the time, but when people say that brings them joy, I support it 100%. Well, thank you for coming on to our show. We'll have your information in our show notes for sure. So folks can check the link out on the show notes when the episode drops. We appreciate your time. We appreciate your wisdom. We appreciate you being an educator, even if you feel like that was not a very long time. It was what it was, right?
And I'm still educating, just in a different way.
Exactly. And that's the beautiful part, right? It's like the traditional classroom space is not where the teaching ends. We get to keep showing up and we get to keep being educators and being educated well outside the classroom. So super grateful for you, and we appreciate your wisdom. And for all you out there who are enjoying this podcast, remember to follow us on our LinkedIn page. Make sure that you check out our pod page at the Exit Interview Podcast, and we will talk to you all later. Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode of The Exit Interview, a podcast for Black educators, please help support the podcast by sharing it with others, posting on social media, and leaving a rating and review. And as always, we're looking for former Black educators to interview. If that's you, send us a message on our website, exitinterviewpodcast.com.